Hey everybody, Sally here, back with the Connection Project, and I'm really thrilled to have my guest here today, Dave Roberts. And he's actually a retired addiction professional, an adjunct professor of psychology, child life, bereavement support specialist, speaker, and workshop presenter on grief. And this is how he's come into my sphere a little bit. He's used his experience as a parent who experienced a transition of an adult child due to cancer over 21 years ago. And he's taken that grief that he experienced to help educate people about grief, help them transform the relationships with their transition loved ones so they can find peace and re-engage in life again. And I actually had never met Dave, but he was doing some workshops at a great place near me, Move, Breathe, and Live. And I had been wanting to get to one of his grief workshops, and it's just the timing was never good for me. And I just heard so many amazing things. And then I was coming to find that a lot of my clients, and actually in my Sedona retreat, so many of the women that I'm working with and that have come into my sphere have suffered a lot of grief. And that isn't exactly why they came to me. But it was something that I felt energetically. People were coming to me, choosing me, and I'm not by any stretch a grief specialist. And so I was really thinking a lot about Dave, unbeknownst to him, and then asked him if he would love to be a guest because I really wanted to dig into this with him. So welcome, Dave. I'm really, really excited to have you here today. And I think this is a subject that is not probably discussed enough in a lot of realms. And um, this subject, I know when I was in healthcare, like I don't know that we deal with this the way we could with death and dying and with grief and how that shows up for people. So I'm super excited to dig in with you today and yeah, and hear all you have to say. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Sally. It's great to meet another fellow upstate New Yorker as well, too. It's very rare that I get to do a podcast with somebody who's in the same area as me, so this is a treat for me. I've also heard some great things about your work through, I think it was Juliana Hardy at Move, Breathe, Live, and so I'm really happy to be here today, and hopefully this will be a conversation that will be a benefit to your listeners.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. I think this is a subject that we just don't talk about enough. It's just a regular way of life. And then, a lot of times it's just about suppressing it or not talking about it. And so the more I think that we talk about this and identify this as a real, real thing, and there's so many components to grief, right? So
Mhm.
so excited to dig in with you today. And I know maybe you could just tell our listeners a little bit about your story because you started, right, an addiction specialist and now doing all this work with grief and both things really so important. So much important work that you're doing. So just maybe bring us up to speed, the listeners up to speed, and what even made you, I know you've had a loss of a daughter, so whatever you want to share with us on that to get you from point A to point B here.
Well, one of the things, Sally, I've learned particularly in the last 21 plus years is that we have no control over the challenges that are going to befall us during our existence on Earth. As you mentioned earlier, I was an addictions counselor for the state of New York at the McPike Addiction Treatment Center. I was also a clinical supervisor. I worked there from 1986 right through July of 2012, after which time I retired. My previous career had also been in addictions. I worked as a stop DWI probation officer and also as an outpatient substance abuse counselor. So all I knew was addictions. I was a credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor. I also have a master's in social work from SUNY Albany, which was conferred upon me in 2000, in May of 2002. So, I was on what I thought was a very predictable path and a linear path that many individuals in this lifetime will lead. I anticipated that after I retired, I would embrace, becoming a grandfather. At the time, I had three children. I would embrace grandfatherhood. I was planning on doing a little private practice and some teaching. And then the universe kind of looked at me and said, well, there's going to be a change in plan. And it was not a plan that my soul had ever thought about signing up for, but it was the plan that was presented to me. So I'm going to fast forward to September 2001. My daughter, Janine, uh, was living with her with her significant other at the time out of the house. She called me and said, "Dad, we have to talk to you." And I'm thinking there's some type of an emergency, somebody died, something, because she said there was a sense of urgency in her voice. I says, "Everything okay?" She goes, "I'll tell you when we get there." So she comes in, and for those who knew Janine, there was no subtlety about Janine. She just got right to the point. She opened up the door to our kitchen, walked in, and before the door even closed, Sally, she said, "Dad, I'm pregnant." So she was at the time 17. Um, I did not get angry. I did not get upset. I liked her significant other very much. I still do to this day. Um, I just wanted to make sure that they had a plan, that they knew what they were going to be doing moving forward. And I was satisfied with that. So though I had wished they had waited a little longer, and I told them that I was good with what they were going to do moving forward. As it turns out, it was in the grand design, this was her pregnancy was meant to happen when it happened and how it happened. On May 2nd, 2002, she gave birth to a beautiful little girl, Brianna Lee Bridge. Bridge is her last name. Um, who is now 22 years old and has a child of her own and one on the way. So now I'm a great grandfather. I will be twice over.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to give you some dates, and this will give you an idea for you and your listeners in terms of how life can turn on a dime. May 2nd, I felt the ecstasy of being a grandparent for the first time with Brianna's birth. On May 19th, I was notified by SUNY Albany that I had completed the requirements for my MSW. And on right around that time, my daughter had an MRI on her right foot. She had injured her right foot in a freak accident early in her pregnancy, did not respond to traditional medical intervention for a swollen foot. Eventually, she got an MRI, and it was after Brianna was born because that's what she insisted on doing. They found an undefined 8 centimeter mass at the bottom of her foot. It had been biopsied just around the time that I received news of my MSW degree being conferred upon me, and they found that it was her mass was a malignant tumor that was obviously highly suggestive of cancer. The diagnosis was confirmed on May 26th. On June 3rd, we went to the Dana-Farber Research Institute and Hospital out in Boston because they're one of the best hospitals in the country and in the world for pediatric sarcoma research. They told me that and Janine and her significant other and my wife Sherry, who were there for for the briefing, that she had a rare and aggressive form of cancer called alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, a connective muscle tissue cancer. They told us in a 5-minute consult there was no cure for cancer. She had bone marrow and lymph node involvement. She had all the mortality indicators. And they basically told us in a few words that unless there's a miracle, your daughter's going to die. So here I went from the ecstasy of being a grandparent to the satisfaction of completing a 25-year journey to get my MSW to now finding myself with a terminally ill adult child, knowing full well that she was in all likelihood going to die unless there was a miracle cure, and thinking, what am I going to do when this happens? So that's just an indication of how life turns on a dime. And I talk to individuals, I tell them, be grateful for every day that you have. Be grateful for the great moments because you never know when life's going to throw challenges at you. She fought for 10 months. Her cancer eventually got into 80% remission, but with cancer, 100% remission is what is needed.
Mhm.
The other 20% remetastasized after the holidays. It was January 2003 where we got a 1 to 3 month prognosis for her cancer. On February 19th, she opted to discontinue treatment. We brought in hospice services, And on March 1st, 2003, at 12:30 in the morning, she transitioned to a new existence. I call it now transitioned
Mhm.
from the physical world to the spiritual plane. And that set me on a path that, believe me, no child care book that I read prepared me for it. None of my past training, my past education, my past work with individuals who experience trauma as a result of addiction or trauma that was separate from addiction or coexisted with addiction. None of that, Sally, began to prepare me for, trying to learning how to re-engage in a world that was totally terrifying to me. Um, at age 47, we talk about midlife crises. A lot of guys will, try to get their hair dyed. And of course, I'm using hyperbole. They get a sports car. They try to get together with a younger woman just to prove that they have some virility left.
Right.
At 47 years old, I'm trying to figure out who the heck am I? What's my world going to look like moving forward? And do I even want to re-engage in this world again without the physical presence of my daughter? Because when I tell you, Sally, that eternity could have started for me any day after she transitioned, I would have gladly taken it. Not that I was suicidal, but I was just ready. I said, I just want to be where she is.
Mhm.
And there were some days that the pain was so intense that I wanted eternity to start right then and there and just escape the pain. But as I've come to discover, there was a greater purpose for me to discover as a result of the challenges with her transition. And though it is a path that I never thought I would have ever embraced or willingly, it is a path now that I willingly walk. And it's a, all in all, I feel blessed over what life has given me today.
Beautiful. Dave, thank you so much for sharing that. And, I'm sorry about your daughter, but once you change into I love the word transition because it helps me anyway. And I think as I've kind of experienced hmm, different phases of my own spiritual awakening, I guess I want to call it whatever we want to call it. I have a different faith and a different thought about like what happens when we die. And I love the word transition because it means that like things aren't necessarily over. It's just a different existence for me. And that will meet up again. And so I love that you use that. And as hard as that experience was, and really, I know you've probably shared this a million times in 21 years, but it's still um, like really touches my heart. And I just think being able to share this with other people and having this, we're all set here. I think you touched on it right when we started about our soul contracts or soul choices, or like maybe this isn't what you thought your soul was signing up for, but I think sometimes we don't really know what that is, or we do, we just consciously don't know. And you've really sounds like you've been here to have a path around this grief that someone needs to do, right? And it's really not an easy task for people, especially after loss, although who knows more about it than the person that has experienced it. I've seen that in my own practice. Like I don't do anything with my clients that I haven't experienced myself that hasn't helped me. And it's not because it's about me. It's just I feel like I've experienced it, so I can really speak to it and know that it works. So I just want to thank you. Because I don't know if as a grief counselor you get thanked for your service, right? But I mean, I just think this is something that I saw in the hospital, death, dying, grief. In general, I just don't know that we handle it well in this country. And so I think this is a huge topic that needs to be discussed. So I really thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. And I also want to, I mean, Janine's transition wasn't the first loss I've ever experienced.
Mhm.
As I told you before we started recording, I've danced with grief since I've been 5 years old. And the first loss I remember was my father abandoning me and my mother. My mother raised me as an only child from the age of 5 right on up. And that was the first, I eventually found out that he transitioned when I was 11 years old. I didn't find that out until I was 14. I never saw him again. And that and early experiences matter. And I tell my students at Utica University, this is what happens in childhood matters.
Mm,
And if the narrative isn't changed early on, that narrative goes with us and it impacts our relationships and impacts our choices going forward. And for me, there was a lot of, I guess, bewilderment. I was wondering, did my father leave because he didn't love me? But as it turns out, when I was 60 years old, and we'll get to this because as part of my transition into or embracing a different perspective, there was one person in particular that was responsible for that. And I want to get to that, just but so remind me if for some reason I tend to I forget about that, Sally. But um, at 60 years old, I learned to love my father as much as the mother who had raised me because my father was a victim of his own history. He couldn't change his history. His history dictated that he couldn't stay in a traditional marriage,
mhm,
that when there was emotional attachment requested of him, he left. He just, as his ancestors did before him. And
mhm.
I'm a firm believer that our histories are inextricably woven into our DNA and perhaps can give us a little bit of insight in terms of why intergenerational trauma exists. Um, so, but I learned to come to peace with my father and his history based on what I learned from the challenges that I experienced with my daughter's transition. So a lot of the transformation that has occurred has had a trickle down effect in other areas of my life.
Yeah, that's so important. Maybe you can even go a little bit deeper on that piece because I see that a lot with my clients and I use a lot of forgiveness work sometimes.
Yep.
And people, if you're talking about forgiveness, they think that, we're going to just say like it's okay. But it's really, for me, I see it as like it was something I was holding on to. And then it's just so heavy. And that becomes very heavy,
Yep.
even if we can't see it. And so forgiveness is, like they say, it's like drinking poison every day, right? So
Yep.
we just keep drinking it if we just hold on to that. So maybe you could just talk a little bit to the
Mhm.
audience about what that intergenerational trauma does and how it affects us because I'm 100%. I can tell already we could talk all day, but it really does affect us. And then the fact that you were able to make that conscious choice about your dad who left because he only knew what he knew and it's really in his DNA um, and what that releases in you because it had to
Mhm.
release something to let you to have a more productive life moving forward. Can you just talk
I
about that
can
a
get
little
in.
bit?
I sure can. And first of all, this will probably be a good time to introduce to you the person, my friend, soul sister, mentor, who was responsible for putting me on this path. And in the first 7 years after my daughter Janine's transition, I did, I think, what every parent who experienced the transition of a child would do. I tried to read books and memoirs by other parents who had been on the journey a little bit longer to see what would work for me, what
Mhm,
worked for them, to see if it would work for me, and also find some comfort. Uh, my wife, Sherry, found a really good bereaved parent support group locally that was sponsored by a local funeral home. And going to that support group made me feel not alone in my grief. For everybody there, our shared pain was a gateway to hope that we could get through to the other side of grief. And I really also impress upon individuals and emphasize find yourself a good support group in addition to a good therapist and a support group that understands the nature of your loss. I think good support plus good therapist and other means of external support outside of support groups and therapy can help individuals get through to the other side of trauma. So I had met Patty through the woman's name is Patty Farino. She's an interfaith minister, originally from Long Island, living in South Carolina. We would take another whole show to just talk about the entire relationship, Sally, how we got together. But through pure serendipity, we met, and this is the abridged version, at a conference that I was helping to organize in the the Turning Stone Casino and Resort in Oneida, which was called Beyond Words: Creative Approaches to Grief. After the workshop was over, after the training was over, we had a great training. The day after, I took everybody up to Old Forge, took three of the presenters up to Old Forge so they could see the change of leaves. They were having this intense conversation about spirituality. And I basically looked up at the sky and said, I want to be where they are. To this day, I don't know what prompted me to say that, but I think it was my soul calling for something that I needed. My soul knew what I needed was a different perspective before my mind and brain had a chance to catch up to that. And I believe intention is a powerful predictor of what the universe will manifest for us. And I think to paraphrase Pablo Coelho, when we want something bad enough, the universe will conspire to see that we get it.
Hmm.
And what I got was something that exceeded my my grasp, um, exceeded what I asked for. I just wanted some enhanced spiritual knowledge to give me some more tools to help me work through the next phase of my grief. Um, and what I got was a whole different perspective. Now, mind you, Sally, I was very empirically based, and I still am, but I rejected all types of spirituality. I kind of thought it was like woohoo stuff, like, in the cloud stuff. And I had vehemently rejected that in my entire life. And I came to find out later through work with a shamanistic holistic practitioner why that might have been the case. But I want to get back to Patty. Patty had told me after the conference, she said, well, she had asked me during our pre-conversation, she goes, do you believe in signs? I said, Patty, I really don't pay much attention to that. I really don't believe in that. But I said, I think my daughter sent me a double rainbow on Father's Day, 2009. So but there were other things, Sally, that were happening to me that science couldn't explain, but I couldn't figure out how to integrate it. I said,
Hmm.
well, this seems real, but this goes against all I know about how we prove what is real.
Right.
So I had difficulty integrating that. So eventually, and of course, during the conference, after I saw her, we agreed to exchange a hug during our pre-conversation for prior to the conference. I gave her a hug, and she goes, I think your daughter sent me a rainbow." And I'm thinking to myself, I'm tired, I'm beat after the conference. I said, "Oh, that's nice." And I didn't really give much thought to it after that. But in November, I found myself in Long Island in her home. We were there. I was there after a education or training workshop that we went to that was put on by a then colleague of ours. And at 9:30 at night, I began to understand that my daughter's consciousness was alive and well, and that I could connect with it at any time. Patty is someone who walks a very sacred path, and she's she said, she had a sacred space that she said, I want you to get comfortable, come into come into that space. And from there on, there was a lot of messages that were being communicated with her as a conduit through my daughter, that basically said, hey, you're doing a great job grieving me, but you got other categories in your life that you need to be concerned with. Um, like you're a father, you got two brothers that you need to take care of. You got a wife, you got a grandchild. Um, I'm always going to be here. And I'm thinking to myself, this is what I asked for. And I believed this immediately because I had a 45-minute conversation with Patty earlier, prior to the conference. And that happened because her computer went out when she was trying to register. So if her computer didn't black out, she would have never called me. We might not have met. So you can see all the serendipity leading up to this. Um, and for the entire weekend, there were messages that were being channeled, for lack of a better term, or where Patty was a conduit for, that convinced me that my daughter's consciousness was alive, and I could connect with it at any time. And through marathon conversations that I had with Patty, and I still do, over the 14 years that we've known each other, I began to learn that psychology and spirituality could coexist, could help us create greater awareness about ourselves and the world around us, and our role in relationship to that. and also could help us transcend challenge, in combination. And, and one of the things that we talked about was some of the ancestral stuff with my father and my mother. And during one conversation, she saw my father, and my father had said through her, I just feel very badly that I left, David. That was the message. And by then I had come to understand that his history dictated his choices, that he had no control over the
Mhm.
history that he was born into, that he didn't know another way of of reacting when emotional attachment was asked of him. So I just said, Dad, I forgive you. I understand why you had to leave. And from that, I found out later, through another intuitive, that that was freeing for him and allowed him to continue to grow on the other side. And then one of the things I said to Patty, I said, geez, I mean, he shouldn't really have any, that was in a past, that was in this earthly existence. She goes, but sometimes she goes, spirits will have, will have issues that they still have regret about in the earthly plane, and they have to work through that on the other side. One of the things, and just for your audience, Patty does not consider herself to be a medium. She says, what I do because I sincerely want to help people find peace. And, um, and she came into my life, and I had other individuals who were planting seeds, but Patty was like, if you look at the ideal vanilla fudge sundae, you're looking for the perfect cherry on top. Patty was the perfect cherry on top of that sundae. That just, and everything began to fall into place for me. One of the things that she taught me was, she said, don't limit yourself just to me as a spiritual teacher. Bring in other individuals in your life. And there's a shamanistic holistic practitioner that you might know. Her name is Susan Roback, that I've worked with for several years. Um, and we had talked about in a previous session about the anger over I had over with my mother, um, over her decision to overprotect me and kind of like smother me after my father had left. And so she put me on the table. She did soul journey, and she said, what I saw was in either Roman times or Egyptian times. There was an individual riding a chariot, driving a chariot, and there was a 4-year-old boy in the chariot. The chariot overturned and crushed the child, and the child died. So I started to ponder that, and I said, you know, that may give me an understanding from a soul contract perspective why my mother was so overprotective. What if that, and I believe what she saw was my father and me in a previous lifetime. I was a child who had died. I was a child who had transitioned, and my mother wasn't there to do anything about it. So
Mhm.
I believe we contracted for centuries later for the mother-son relationship, and her contract with me is that no matter what happens, no matter how angry you get with me, I'm not losing you again. And that was a way for her to resolve her soul's karma. And that gave me understanding in terms of why the challenge from a sacred perspective was presented to me to be a parent who experienced a transition of a child. It was kind of like the soul balancing out, um, you know, karma, for the responsibilities of the soul. I had died on one end. Now I had to learn what it was like to live with a child who had died. My soul needed to, now, were there days, Sally, when I looked up at the sky and said, what the heck was my soul thinking? Absolutely. But did that perspective give me peace? Yeah. Doesn't mean that I grieve any less. No. I mean, there are days that I still yearn for my daughter's physical presence, but I
Mhm.
understand now that it's just part of the deal. Okay. It's just part of the deal. That, and it's a microcosm of life. We don't have happy days 24 hours a day. We have moments of happiness, we have moments of sadness, we have moments of bewilderness, but it all leads to genuineness. So I believe what I've learned through my own work through my discussions with Patty, through my work with Susan and other spiritual mentors, is that we embrace genuineness and that everything has something to teach us. Um, and one of the things that I've learned to do is continue the bond with my daughter by transforming the relationship, creating bonds with her through, consciously bringing her to memory. I've lit incense, listened to music that we both liked, and I immediately feel peace. I talk about her. We bring her up in conversation whenever we can, whenever the opportunities present itself. And that is, I think, how we get through grief, by maintaining connection with the essence of our loved ones and integrating the best parts of our loved ones into who we are. That changes our narrative moving forward. And we literally and symbolically move forward in our grief when we're able to do that type of integration. So the work that I did with Patty, just with coming to peace with Janine, translated into so many different areas and allowed me to meet other individuals as well that have helped me get to this point in time. And I'm still a work in progress. I'm still going to be a work in progress till the day I transition. So
I know. Well, join the club. That's what I say all the time. I'm still a work in progress. But it's interesting. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And it's so amazing when we find that person that almost like, I guess, I believe is sent to us to really just allow us that glimmer into what else is out there.
mhm.
And when that world starts to open, it's almost like a whole nother world opens. That's how I feel anyway. When I started to experience those things, wanting to have a different life, wanting to experience things differently than I was in my midlife crisis, of feeling like I don't even know. Again, like you kind of said, like, who am I? What is, and I didn't have the loss of a child, but I still had these feelings. And then when you start to look into the world of spirituality, it really does open up a Pandora's box of stuff that is really pretty amazing, I think.
It is. I'm, I never, I tell my students this, I tell anybody who'll listen to me, is that I never woke up one day and said, I'm going to study death. I mean, that was the farthest thing from my mind, because as you mentioned earlier, we're a society that does not like to talk about death.
Mhm.
We're a society that's fascinated with death, and we're fascinated with shows that and documentaries that deal with it. But as far as talking about it, we don't, and we need to. We need to understand that this is a temporary stopover for us in this
Right,
existence. So we have to use that knowledge to lead a fulfilling life. And we need to embrace our own impermanence in
right.
order to find meaning in this lifetime. And so, but I mean, I never thought that I would be walking this path where I'd be talking to students about death, dying, and bereavement. But it's typically, and the people I've talked to that have embraced the study of thanatology as a field have gotten into it because of personal tragedy, not professional choice.
Right.
And like I said, if you told me over 22 years ago that this is what I'd be doing right now, I would probably look at you like you had two heads. And since I was an addictions professional back then, I would have probably asked you to get drug tested, to say, but again, we never know the challenges that life's going to present itself. And, the quality of our lives are dictated not so much by how we perceive life to be fair, but it's dictated by how well we respond to the challenges that are presented to us.
Mhm. I love that. It's so true. That's so true. And I can understand. I mean, I don't think if you would have asked me 10 years ago when I was managing an ICU hospital, that I would have an altar and have a spirit animal and being in Peru and now coaching people around trauma and talking about intergenerational trauma and doing breath work. There was no way that that would have been happening. I mean, my life is completely different. And it wasn't like I woke up one day and said I was gonna explore all these other options. I think it just, We do have a contract, and it was probably in there. I just wasn't able to see it or ready to do this. And so I think for you, you were here to for many lessons.
Hmm.
And this was part of your work. So it is amazing
Yeah.
though. It is amazing. And I love that you have that spirituality side. I'm not saying to even to the audience, if you're listening, that you have to be spiritual, you don't have to be spiritual. But I think when Dave talks about that, bringing that piece in, it just gives you a different perspective. It really, really does.
Yeah. And if you ask me who the person was when I was like when I was 47 years old, I can't even begin to tell you. I mean, you would need a search party to find that person because, and I look at it now that if I was the same person today at 69 than I was at 47, there would had been no growth. There,
Hmm.
I would have basically, my time on earth probably would have been over long before now because there was nothing left for me to learn in this lifetime.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that Patty taught me was also how to look at the moment of death. And I really, for those individuals who have lost a loved one to a terminal illness, whether it be cancer or Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's, the last day of that person's life in early grief, at least for me, for my daughter, haunted me. Um, because I remember being waking up at 12 midnight by my sister-in-law saying, "You better get out here. It's time," which meant that Janine was ready to transition into a new existence. So I got up, went and held her hand. She took two quick breaths and then she transitioned. And I told Patty for years, I told her for a couple of years after we had met, I said, it always haunts me that I was the last person to see her alive. And she said to me, what if you look at it this way? What if you look at it as if you were the first person to escort her into her new existence?
Hmm.
And I looked at that and I said, just that little simple shift,
Yeah.
it caused me to look at the moment of her passing differently. Now, I also realize that individuals who've lost loved ones of sudden death don't get an opportunity to do that. But for those who have lost a loved one to terminal illness and they bel they are haunted because they were the last person to see them alive, try to flip the script as Patty taught me to look at yourself as that person who was chosen at that moment to usher them into their new existence. There's there's no sacred reason or human reason why it was me that was chosen, but that had to be part of our sacred contract.
Hmm.
Um, and
I love
that
that
had to
little
be part of our,
shift. I love that little shift because I think so many times in life, right? It's perspective and how we can shift things slightly in that little shift. And in my experience, especially in the hospital setting, because I've dealt with a lot of death there, and I've had death in my own life or transition, but a lot of times people, I always felt like people were waiting, or sometimes
Mhm.
there would be like stress about that they didn't get there in time. But sometimes I think that and I guess you could look at this like rationalize it however, but I think sometimes after spending this much time with people when they're getting ready to transition, sometimes they are waiting for a person to get there, and sometimes they don't think the person is maybe going to be able to be there in that transitionary moment. And I think I think that I always felt, whether I'm right or not, like intuitively that there was a choice there and there was a decision around how that was going to happen
Yep.
in these certain times. Even in my own family, I felt like there was there was things that my mom, for example, she I felt like was waiting, and a lot of
Mhm.
family members. And then sometimes they f- they almost like the person that wanted to be there but couldn't be there. I think that they transitioned without them there because they thought it was too difficult for them, even in that transitionary period. I feel like there's like a lot going on, even though we're thinking that this person doesn't. have any awareness, but I think there's like for me, and I'm not a grief expert, but just from seeing a lot of that, there's just seems like there's always a lot going on
And
around that.
and I think there is. And I think the other thing too is that sometimes people aren't in the room when that person transitions because they're not supposed to be. Maybe
Yeah,
the
100% I believe
transition,
that.
yeah, the transition loved one has already done their closure to this relationship, to this
Hmm.
lifetime. They're not needed there. But the people that they feel are going to be needed are there. The ones that they feel they've already done closure with are not. And the other thing is that sometimes people will die alone, but you look at it as if, let's say their family's already come in, they've said their last words. They don't need them to be there when
Hmm.
they they've done what they needed to do. They can transition in peace. And so, and I think to me, though, there are more sacred reasons for that occurring. I don't
Hmm.
think human law can explain why certain people are at the person's bedside or others aren't. I think it's more it's part of that. It's like we talked about soul contract or sacred contracts, or just from another standpoint, I've done my closure with those individuals that I needed to. They don't need to be at my bedside to see me off. They already have seen
Right,
me off.
right. I like that. Yeah, I've definitely seen that over the years. Um, and it doesn't feel, I remember in the beginning of my career, I used to never want anyone to die alone. So I was like, felt like I had to stay in the room. But I think that was more a me thing necessarily than a them thing, right? For me, I had this helper, thing about wanting to be in the room with them, if their family couldn't be there. But as I've explored more realms, yeah, I think that sometimes was a me thing about wanting to be with them versus them being alone. Can you talk a little bit? Yeah, that's really just amazing work. Anything else for our listeners around that? I think that shift, that's a huge one,
Hmm.
about being with transition and being okay that if you're not there, like
Yeah,
sometimes you're
I
not
think,
supposed to be there.
yeah, you're not supposed to be. And a lot of times, I think we may tend to ruminate, and ruminating about things in early grief is kind of is very, very very normal. And we feel guilty. Well, geez, maybe we should have been there, maybe we should have done more. I think the guilt kind of is an extension of the yearning that we feel, and also the love that we feel that we should have done more. And I found myself in that pattern for a while. But then eventually you come to realize that you did the best you could given the hand of cards that were dealt with you, and that you did not have control over something that was out of your control, as
Hmm.
much as you would have liked to have control. So that's the other part of forgiveness. But my favorite piece about forgiveness, and I love this quote, and I've seen a lot of different quotes, is probably from a very unlikely source. This is a gentleman who transitioned January 7th, 2020. He was not one of the, he was the greatest drummer of my generation. Guy by the name of Neil Peart from the Canadian rock group Rush, three-piece
Yeah,
band.
Rush.
And he had his own series of tragedies in the late 90s where his daughter and his wife transitioned within 10 months of each other. He took a 55,000-mile road trip, took a 4-year hiatus from Rush to basically find himself. And two quotes that I love in that book, among about his book Ghost Rider Travels on the Healing Road. Two things. He goes, I left a going on that road trip to determine the type of person I wanted to be and the type of world I wanted to live in, which is what we're all faced with when we go through life altering challenges, whatever that may be. But he also talked about forgiveness. And there was one quote, and I get chills talking about this because it was just so powerful and profound. He said something to the effect that there would be no life for me, there would be no peace for me, unless I learned to forgive life for what it had done to me, learn to forgive others for being alive, and eventually learn to forgive myself for being alive. And when I looked at that, I said, that goes to me to the heart of forgiveness when we go through traumatic, especially when we lose a child or
Yeah.
we lose a young spouse or a loss that defies the nature of the universe. It's like, we hold ourselves hostage to the fact that we should have done more, even
Mhm.
though that's part of the process, that we have to go through that to realize that it's not going to be healthy long term for us to stay there. We still got to go through that process and make a conscious choice. Do we want to stay in that or do we want to move through it? But what got me about the Peart quote was learning to forgive life for what it had done to me. That's forgiving the hand of fate.
Right,
And that's the other part that tends to get lost in the transition of forgiveness. It's about forgiving others, it's about forgiving ourselves, but it's forgiving the hand of fate itself. It's
right.
forgiving the universe for throwing this challenge in my path. And he ended up he ended up getting through to the other side. He ended up, reconnected with his bandmates, making some really great music. He was their lyricist, great writer, brilliant lyricist, brilliant writer. Um, and he stayed with them until he retired in 2015 and transitioned in 2020. And I still quote his work to my students. He still is very much an influence. He's one of I call him my spirit guides. He's another one that I take, his teachings are very much a part of who I am. And I never met him,
I'll have to read
never
that
met him.
book. Yeah, I'll have you send me that info and I'll put that in the show notes, actually, that book.
Yep.
Um, yeah, listen, you have to, it's interesting. My in-laws are coming to visit and my father-in-law's 96. And so they were asking me last time they were here, they don't really understand what I do now. Before it was easy. I was a nurse in the hospital.
Hmm. Yep.
And now I was trying to explain to them like kind of what I do, and then it got us on a kind of a spiritual talk. And and it was interesting because my father-in-law is 96 and he said, I was asking them what they think happens, after they transition, and he really did talk a lot about like there is no God, or there isn't anything other than us being in a human body, because how could things happen in the world the way they do? And I have to say I kind of probably used to feel that way, but I don't feel that way anymore since I've had a bit more awareness around the universe and fate and forgiveness and trauma and just all the things, and have a more spiritual mindset around
Yep.
how things work for me. And it really does allow you to lighten a bit, even through the dark times. I'm not saying things aren't dark, right? I mean, I've had a lot of darkness too. I just haven't had the loss of a child. But there is some light that happens, um, because I just feel differently now about
Hmm.
that things are going to be different. It doesn't mean I won't be sad if someone transitions before me. Um,
Yeah.
but I do honestly feel like that won't, things are like, I don't want to say recycled, but like I'm going to see them again. I don't really know what
Hmm.
that looks like, but I feel honestly sure. And it's interesting. I had a past life regression, and I don't know, a couple years ago now. And my husband, who doesn't believe in any of, like, he think, when I first left my job, he thought like, what's happened to my wife? She's like lost her mind. And I don't expect him to completely understand, just be supportive, which he was. And I had this past life regression, and the first life that we went back, I was male, which is not shocking to me that I was male in every life I've gone back, but we were friends, we were buddies. And, I've always had this running joke with him on how, like, I'm your wife, I'm not your buddy. Like, you treat me like I'm your like pal. Like that's been a running joke for a long time. And my first life back, we were both medical, we were both mess. We had been childhood friends from a young age. We're in the military, in like Pearl Harbor, apparently, according to my passive regression. And he drowned. And I was like very hysterical looking for him in my past life regression, like my buddy, my buddy. I kept saying those words. And
Hmm.
he's always had a fear of drowning. So that's the first time that he's been like a little bit like, because these things had been occurring, like we had been talking about all of this for years and years and years. And then I had this past life regression, and it was so like put everything together that we've
Yep.
definitely been together. We've been together before. It was just in a very different relationship. That opened his eyes a little bit, but he's not ready to completely. But yeah, I mean, I just think we have a soul contract, and sometimes we
Mhm.
don't fulfill it. And so we're back to see,
Yeah.
and we make choices on why, who we choose to be our parents, even if it is a rough
Mhm.
go. Um, but it is definitely a different way of looking at things. There was one thing I wanted to ask you too, because I know I'm keeping you a little bit long today.
No, I've got no place to go and all day to do it, so we're good.
I want to ask you, and this might be a little bit off topic, but as far as grief, um, the way we handle grief in this country and transition, death, whatever anybody wants to call it in this country, in so many other countries, sometimes it's more celebratory, right? They're
Hmm.
celebrating their life. And I know we have celebrations of life now, but I notice this a lot in healthcare. And when we have such a melting pot in our area, right, in Utica and upstate New York, we have a very melting pot. So I experience that a lot with people coming in and wanting different things done prior to passing. And I was a bit of a rule breaker with all of that in the ICUs because I would just, if I could make it happen, I made it happen because that was their last ask for their family member.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, and back centuries, right? Tribes, I mean, it was a celebration. It's not like they weren't sad, but there was a celebration around life. And so, I guess my question is, what do you think? What do you think that's about? And what do you think we can do differently, or that we could even talk just a teensy bit to our guests about how we can celebrate that transitionary period differently to give everybody a little bit more closure versus this finality, right? Because I think in that celebratory piece, um, in so many of these tribes and so many of these other
Yep.
cultures, it is so celebrated. And here, I've dabbled with the idea of death doula myself, but I mean, I think there's so much that we can, although it is a lot of change, right? But
Hmm.
how it could be different to celebrate those last, especially sometimes a tragic death is one thing, but like if it's somebody is sick for a while, how can we help them to be more accepting? Because what I saw in the hospital a lot too was, and even in regular life, right? It's we don't want that person to pass, right? Which is a normal reaction.
Hmm.
But then we convince them that they shouldn't go, or they're really sick, but we convince them to hang on and do everything. And I think there's a piece there that is we miss, like taking that
Hmm.
time and having this moment in this human experience that can be so much more than sometimes it is. Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, yeah, and there's a couple of things that came into mind. I'm just going to throw this out in no particular order.
I wasn't planning on
Um,
asking you this, but this is something that I think about a lot on how
okay,
this.
I'm going to try. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry
Oh no,
about
it's
that.
okay.
Um, I'm going to throw out a couple things in no particular order. One of the books that I have my students and my Utica University students read in my death, dying, and bereavement class was Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom.
Mm,
And Maury Schwartz, as you know, um, made history by bringing people at that time in the 90s into teaching them how to die. And he did that through his work with Mitch Albom. He also did that through several interviews with Ted Koppel and lessons on living. One of the things that he had was a living funeral. He said, I don't want to wait until I'm dead for people to celebrate me. I want to be celebrated. I want to hear what they have to say now. So one thing could be a living funeral. I think there's an organization in South Korea that actually does that. I don't know the name of it, but I think if you Google it, there are organizations now that are doing living funerals. That does, I think, one or two things. I think one, it helps individuals put closure to the physical relationship. Secondly, it doesn't make death as daunting, or
hmm
the moment of death is daunting. And that person is having an opportunity to craft his or her their end of life chapter as they see fit. The other thing you mentioned about technology, doctors take their Hippocratic oath very seriously. They take death personally. So they are going to want to use technology to use life-saving techniques to maintain sanctity of life as opposed to quality of life. And I'm not saying this as a negative to the medical profession. at all. But you take a look at healthcare. We spend in the last year of our lives the most on healthcare than we do at any other time.
Yep.
75% of individuals who transition are in the hospital the year before. And this is because I think, also the families want to believe that they've done everything they could do. But then there has to be to preserve life, but there has to be a decision. When are we preserving sanctity of life at the expense of quality of life? And Atul Gawande is another person who wrote a book, Being Mortal. Um, and I forgot the subtitle off the top of my head, but Gawande is a physician from India, based in the United States now, and he questioned the way what modern Western medicine handled end of life chapters. And he kind of believed that the end of life chapter, and I'm paraphrasing this, there needs to be some empowerment for the terminally ill individual and the family to determine what do they want to have at the end of life, what treatments are they willing to experience, what are they not willing to experience, how do they want to craft their end of life chapter, as opposed to, do I want to be maintained at the expense of quality of life, or do I want to make sure my end of life chapter is an extension of the quality of life I've lived in my other chapters? So I think that involves us as a society looking at death differently, looking at um, our life-saving measures differently, looking at how do we define end of life chapter? Is it by the technological procedures that are being implemented to maintain life at the expense of quality of life, or is it the memories that we can create at our end of life chapter that will prepare us for the transition into our next existence? So um, I think it's it's adopting a different mindset,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
individually and collectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw that so much. I mean, I just in general, even when I was talking to my in-laws, it's, and I saw it in the hospital a lot. So yes, we have palliative care, which, it's hard to approach that when someone is so sick because people genuinely think that if you're approaching palliative for just end of life care and help, that it's, we just want to pull the plug,
Yep.
which is not the case. But when you're discussing it the first time in the ICU, it does kind of look like that. And we have such a thought around death, and yes, technology, we keep people alive forever, but are we really keeping them, like, where is that line of like what is really happening? And I do think it's obviously a very cultural shift.
Yep.
But it's always been on my mind ever since seeing so many people transition and see people want to hold on and know that family members that are getting ready to transition are ready to go. They're ready many times, but continue to fight because the family wants them to fight. And I know it's a hard thing to let go of, but I just thought it was worth mentioning as we're talking about this topic
Yep.
because and the family members sometimes won't share that with their family, but they will share it with, say, the nurse at the bedside or
Yep.
and I agree 100% about, Western medicine. The doctors, I've seen this time and time again, many time, and I'm not bashing doctors. They see it as also a failure, but sometimes it's just time.
Hmm.
Like it's time. And so I'm not saying I make the decision when it's time, but it is time. And the patient or that human experience, they're ready to go, but everybody's telling them they need to fight, which is such a dilemma on them. So I do think for our listeners, like when you come across that, um, yeah, you got to really think about what the person really, really wants and
Hmm.
listen to that. Like listen to what they're saying. Sometimes they're not just giving up. They're like ready. They're ready. Um, they're ready. Their contract here is up and
Yeah.
they a lot of times are ready. Maybe if they had a choice, maybe they didn't want to transition at this
Yeah.
point, but they know, like you kind of know, right? And so,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because I see in us culturally,
Hmm.
and I think yeah, you're right. We spend so much money. It's insane what goes on. And we really don't talk about it. I mean, with palliative, it's gotten much better in healthcare, but it still has a long way to go. I remember my own mother, she wasn't a do not resuscitate until like there was no turning back. And every time I brought it up, she was honestly, she's passed for a long time now, but she was thinking I was trying to kill her, to kill her. I was like,
Right.
I tried to approach it in so many different ways. But because from a healthcare provider, I just didn't want to see her go through that, knowing that there was no
Yeah.
returning from what was going on with her. Like there was no returning. So to be resuscitated was, but yeah, it's a very slippery slope. And I don't think
Mhm.
we do a really great job in our society on any of that. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts around that.
I think we're getting better in spots, but we still, I think, have a long ways to go. We're still a society that really values happiness and productivity, and happiness as being the key to productivity and fulfillment. And I tell everybody that listen to me, I don't hang around with happy people anymore. I hang around with people who experience many moments of happiness, but they're genuine with all of their emotions as well too. Um, so yeah, but I think it's improving, but we still got a ways to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience, Dave? Because I think we could
Well,
probably talk forever, is my
I think we
guess.
probably could too. If you don't mind, before I share
Yeah.
whatever my final thoughts are, if you don't mind me putting in a little bit of a plug for a book that Patty and I co-authored.
Yes. No, no.
That
I want you to plug away and we'll
okay
share all your info at the show notes too.
for those that are interested more in how Patty and I met, the spiritually transformative experience that I went through, a sample of our conversations that show how psychology and spirituality can be integrated, and the importance of critical thinking for future and younger generations. We co-authored, self-published a book on KDP and on Amazon, and March 1st, 2021 is when we rolled it out. We did that purposely because March 1st was obviously was, as I mentioned earlier, was a day and month and day that my daughter Janine transitioned. It's called When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister. Um, how the woman on the corner of Hunter and Whittier permanently transformed one academic's worldview. And this is the book for those of us who are going to be seeing this on YouTube. And her husband, Marco, is a graphic designer. He did the book design, he did the cover design, he did everything with this. Um, we've been thrilled with the response that we've gotten from people who have read it. Um, it's a book that I told Patty every year since I met her, said, we really ought to write a book and talk about what you did for me. And she's such a private person that she really resisted it. But I kept gently nudging her. And she finally, during the pandemic, she said, yeah, it's time. So we put together the book using Google Doc. She was in South Carolina. I was in upstate New York in Whitesboro. And we put it together, and um, it's a book that for those who want to know a little bit more about my story, know a little bit more about me. There's nothing in there, and about Patty, there's nothing in there that was left unsaid. Everything is out on the table.
I love it.
So,
I love it. I think that we need more of this. I love that part of your story where from academia and an addiction counselor to really opening up to that spiritual, allowing yourself to be open enough to allow that
yep.
in. Because I think it's the same for medicine, right? I'm not against Western medicine at all. That's fed me for 30 years almost. I
Mhm.
think I would love to see the mix of these holistic modalities,
Yep.
spirituality be mixed so that if someone comes in the hospital, it isn't just a pill. Maybe there's Reiki, maybe there's someone is coming in and doing breath work. We're talking about these things, these alternate modalities that can help people, that people have someone to speak to that doesn't just tell them everything is just going to be okay when it's clearly not. I mean, what I see with most clients is people don't feel seen and heard. And that's like, if you ask me one universal thing
Yep.
that I see with every client, people just do not feel seen and heard in this world. And it's important for them to feel that. So I love that you guys have bridged that. I call it the woo and the science, right? Like it shouldn't be
Mhm.
one or the other. It can be this
No.
and this, right?
Yeah.
We need to have the duality of both instead of, because we live in a society that's very black and white. Like it's you're right, so I'm wrong. But
Yeah.
I really aspire that we start to bridge all of these things and we both can be right and we
Yeah.
can take the best of
Hmm.
both to provide this environment for grief, for death and dying, for recovery, for illness, for people that are suffering with anxiety. There's so many things that we can bridge and have it be this and that. And so I love that you guys came together and that you openly say, I would have never been, I would have never, if you asked me that I would be taking this route, but you were open and you allowed that to happen. And I just love everything about that because I think that's where we need to go.
Yep.
Um, I just think that's where we need to go to make change and for healing, and to allow us to just live differently, whether we're here in this human experience and when we transition. I just think it's
Yeah.
so huge. So we're lucky that you guys got together, and I'm sure that was not chance. That was meant to happen.
No,
And you are meant to write
absolutely.
this book, and you are meant to talk about this because it's hard. I know from my husband is very science based, so he's like, "This is so," he always tells me I would be burned at the stake if I lived, so many years ago. But it's still that mentality, right? I'm not saying he's wrong. It's just this mentality. I think we can bridge these. Like these things
Yep.
can be bridged for the best result for us while we're living this human experience. And it just brings a lightness. And I mean, I feel like a lightness when I started to explore these other options. It gives me a little more hope, I guess, too.
Yeah, and it does. And for me, I guess, if I were going to leave everybody with a final thought is, and this is something that we talk about in the book, is what do you believe? Determine what it is you believe and understand that you don't have to abandon your core beliefs to make room for complementary beliefs.
Right.
I still firmly believe in science, but I also believe that there is room for spiritual and holistic practices to expand my thinking. So I believe in science, but I also believe in the integration of both science, spirituality, and holistic practices to give us a greater understanding of behavior, give us a greater understanding of our purpose in the world. So if I leave a final thought, what you believe, stay steadfast in that, but be open to embracing other perspectives that will complement it and give you greater understanding and awareness. If and also not to judge how other people believe, but to learn how they got to that perspective and create space for that, understand it, and take what you think is useful from their perspective and integrate it with yours and leave the rest and allow them to do the same. If we can do that, we can help each other get through challenge. And, just might lay the foundation for a more peaceful planet if we were able to do that with each other.
I love that, Dave. It is so true. It is so true. We don't have to agree always. And I did
Nope.
learn that from so many of my patients' families because they came from all over. And it just get curious, be curious,
Hmm.
and allow yourself to kind of listen to what Dave says. You don't have to take on someone else's beliefs. Just be open and be curious and see what you can take and what you can leave, and that's fine.
Yeah,
Thank you
and we
so
can't.
much.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure, Sally. Like I said, I could talk to you for another hour or
I
so.
know, I know, I know. I definitely will have you come back. I think there's so many things I wanted to ask you and talk about, and you have so many things to share. So I'll definitely have you back. And I hope that today, you guys, I'm going to share all of Dave's his book and the show notes, and I'll get the title of that other book. Anything else he mentioned, we'll share in the show notes. How to get a hold of Dave will be in there. He's by me up in Utica, New York. So but yeah, he all his availability will be shared there, and he has so much more to offer. So yeah, think about that. And I hope that you took something out of here because it was really packed with a bunch of stuff. And this is a big topic I think is so important to talk about. So thank you so much for being here with me today. And we will have you back soon.
My pleasure, Sally. I enjoyed our conversation. Look forward to more.
Thanks. All right, everybody. Listen, I'll see you next week on the Connection Project. Have a great day.